Hello, I'm Brooke, and I'm here with my brother Avery. And we recently took a 13-day trip to Ghana, and we wanted to come on here to talk about it. Many of our friends and family have asked about our trip, so we wanted to share what this experience meant for us. Also, we recognize that we were just so blessed to be able to go on this trip. We're part of the very few African Americans who've been able to go to Ghana in our 20s, and so we wanted to steward this opportunity well. So the first question that we want to jump right in with is, why did we go to Africa? So Avery, tell us why we went.
Sure. Uh, we went to Ghana because in 2020, I started a program at a school of theology that was headquartered in Ghana. And so due to the pandemic, the program was basically fully remote, but the graduation ceremony was planning to be in person. And so I was able to do all of my coursework remotely. And then as Brooke said, towards November, I really had a desire to go to Ghana to experience the country and also to get to see my peers in person, many of whom were Ghanaian. And so that was the primary reason we went to Ghana. And we also included in us going to my graduation ceremony, we included touring the country too, since it would be our first time in Ghana and in Africa more broadly.
Yeah, so I was just so blessed to go to Avery's graduation. He graduated with a master's of theology, master's of arts in theology.
Masters of Arts in Theology and Mission with the World Christianity specialization.
Yes, and he went to a Crofi Kristaller Institute. And that was just I don't know, Avery, your whole, you telling me about your experience was just throughout the entire year, the 9-month program was just so enlightening. So hopefully we'll get to talk a little bit about that. But yeah, as Avery mentioned, for the days that we weren't doing graduation events, we decided to hire a tour guide. We went with Uprise Tour. Yeah, we selected that tour group a month before our trip, and that was the best decision ever. So yeah, so Avery, just let's talk about our initial reactions. Just how was the trip overall, you would say?
Mm. Yeah, so for me, the trip was overall, like you mentioned before, such a blessing to go on. On the trip, I definitely learned about Africa and Ghana more specifically in ways that based upon my education here, would have never, education in the US would have never discovered. And so by me going to Africa and Ghana specifically, I was able to really get to, since my program was remote, I was able to experience the life that my peers were experiencing on a daily basis in a sense. And, just to even see the sun rise on, in that, I mean, don't get me wrong, it was hot there, but overall being in a country where, everyone is Black, um, and and there's a lot of contentment there too, interestingly, uh, in addition to, hard work or, having a hardworking attitude to in dreaming there. So overall, it was a very good trip for me to go on in this time of my life as I, seek, man, what are ways that I can impact the world too, and how can I become more connected to those around me.
Yeah, Avery, I love what you said about, your initial reaction. We're African American, our ancestors are from West Africa. And so even though we don't really have any sort of direct ties to, Ghana, it was still this sort of visceral experience going where our ancestors are from, going to the sort of that general region. And like you mentioned, I think for me, this experience, traveling in general, really forces you to put yourself in someone else's perspective, in someone else's shoes. Yeah. So it was, I think for me, like a little bit shocking in that aspect. Um, like, wow, like I'm actually in the motherland. I'm in Africa. The last time someone in our lineage has been to Africa was when our ancestors, were captured, right? So I
Mhm.
think there was a lot of different emotions and getting on the airplane, crossing the Atlantic Ocean, and then finally like crossing back. So yeah, let's just jump right in. Like, what was the experience like when we landed? First stepping foot in Africa.
Yeah. So we took a 10-hour plane ride. Oh yeah, from Washington DC to Accra. And coming off that plane, definitely was tired. Oh, just want to say?
I was gonna say that before we even got on the plane, just sitting at the terminal because we had a layover, as Avery mentioned, in DC, and like we just was like, oh, let's just watch like the gradual procession of Black bodies that is gonna fill this terminal, and then getting on the plane, it's like all these Black people. You're going to Africa, and it smells like cocoa butter. Traveling um, to across the Atlantic Ocean to Ghana, as soon as we landed in Accra, like, we took our COVID test, we were negative, we got our luggage. And I mean, I think the first thing we realized is like, dang, it's actually really hot here. And that's where we sort of met our tour guide and we drove to the hotel and just seeing like the Black people on billboards. I just was like, wow, like, I don't take this for granted. Um, and then like I remember at the hotel, like our guide kind of gave us an orientation to Ghanaian culture. And that was also really interesting. Hearing how like Ghana is the gateway to Africa, like they had the year of the return. So they've been really like helping African Americans, people of the African diaspora, like connect with their ancestral roots. But also learning about like you have to give you have to give and receive things with your right hand. Like I feel like I couldn't get that down until we were leaving. Like, I'm like, oh, like, I didn't realize how ambidextrous I was. I'm a right-handed, but like, it's not a cultural practice for us. So yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I would say that, in addition to what you said, when I initially got to or initially arrived, so this was my first time, traveling outside of the country and not being in a group,
Hmm.
like, it was just you and me, and so, there was this initial, type of feeling of like, man, like, what are we doing? What have I got us into? But also, there's this deep excitement, like, like, wow, like I'm in a country in Africa. Um, like, wow. And like you mentioned, everyone here, you know, is, virtually everyone is basically, is Black.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so true. What you're saying, like, kind of is a really good segue into like the next question. So yeah, I think the first day, like we settled in, we like went to the beach to like recover a little bit from jet lag, and just take it all in. But then the next day we were able to go to church with one of Avery's professors. And the church was like, first of all, it was a really long service. But it was half in English and half in one of the local languages, which is Tree. And I didn't understand any of it because at that point I didn't have my Ghanaian accent. It took like a few more days for me to acquire the accent so that I could be able to understand. But I remember we were at this luncheon after church, and someone came up to us and was like, welcome home, which was really a very like sweet, like hospitable thing to say. And I mean, Ghana just was so like the people there was just so hospitable. But then he asked a follow-up question like, do you feel like you're at home? So I think Avery, what did you like think about that question?
Well, since he did ask that question directly to you.
Oh yeah, that's a good point. So initially when he asked that question, I was
Was
like, I was like, oh my goodness, like I've been here for 2 days. Like, am I gonna be eating rice the entire time? Because I had just never had West African food and the food was such a shock. And I'm like, oh my goodness, like, do I, answer this question? I didn't realize church was half outside and half indoor. So I was also like I felt like I was being eaten by mosquitoes at that point. When he asked, like, do you feel like you're at home? I was like, okay, do I answer this question politically correctly, or do I answer it how I actually feel at that moment? And I don't know, Avery, like when I turned to you, like I remember you saying, Brooke, I don't like that question. Like, do you feel like you're at home? Because it just presumes 400 years was just a day trip. So, yeah, just tell me more about that sentiment
Yeah,
or where that came from.
yeah, yeah. So I remember saying, yeah, I think I would do. Yeah, I remember sharing with you that I didn't really like that question either. In one, at one point in time, I was like, man, I think that's almost just kind of been offensive. I was to take it in a certain way,
Mm,
for that, very, fact that you said that um, there's been, a centuries long history of separation
mm.
between blacks in Africa and those who are of the historic diaspora. Um,
Yeah. And I think another thing to mention is that, we have someone in our family who's taken an ancestry DNA test and it tracks back to Nigeria. I wonder if we would have felt at home there. But I think you bring up a really good point in terms of like the centuries long separation. Yeah.
yeah, and even speaking to that, even as I think of it now, it caused me to wonder too, like, what about African Americans like ourselves who may have immigrated to Ghana, and if their responses were, yes, I feel at home, or if they've had an evolution of a response, should we have answered, not yet, for example? Like, is there ever a time when we will feel quote unquote at home? I guess it kind of gets into more like, what have we as African Americans formed into here
Yes.
that you know that that will cause us to say, like no, like we are not at home, but it's like, but where are we at home?
Yeah. I can't help but think of the scripture like, fox have hold of birds of the air, have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. I think that what you're bringing up, Avery, is this really important point about how we have to honor the experiences of our ancestors. So I think that's something that was really important that I took away from our trip to Ghana is like, how do we honor the experiences of our ancestors? And not just sort of, and just hold space for that, hold space for their stories and their experience. And so I think that like kind of segues really well into the next question about like, what did we do? So the way our trip was organized was on the second day with our tour guide, we were able to go to the W.E.B. Du Bois Center. And so as we were settling in and just wondering like, how do we take in this place? It was really cool to be able to, you know, go to this place that was dedicated to an African American, and just to learn about that 20th century solidarity between W.E.B. Du Bois and President Kwame Nkrumah. So, um, yeah, like the first president of Ghana, President Kwame Nkrumah, was a student of W.E.B. Du Bois, and President Nkrumah studied in the U.S. like during this time of segregation and civil rights, and he was able to, yeah, he studied theology and he was able to learn from the civil rights and be able to like translate that back into the situation or the plight of, people in the Gold Coast, Africans in the region of Ghana. And he was able to sort of say that like Ghanaian, I mean, he observed that like Ghanaian independence was happening too slow. And so he came back and was like, hey, like we need independence now. I think it was really interesting to be at that space and just to sort of see their 20th century solidarity between Africans and African Americans. Something I had really never thought about. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I feel similarly. It was very interesting to us, to yeah, I mean, when W.E.B. Du Bois flew to Ghana, I believe he was in his 90s, you know.
Yeah. Yep.
Um, and so but like the fact that they so where he went to was a place where he lived and did much of his work. I believe there was some type of um uh document that he was finishing up, an encyclopedia.
Yeah, an encyclopedia. And yeah, you mentioned a really good point about when he flew. I would say he fled to Ghana because at that time he was becoming really unpopular in the US. And at that time the president Kwame Nkrumah like made a like built him a bungalow where he could sort of study and but also for him to sort of be able to help this sort of 20th century solidarity because you know W.E.B. Du Bois was really convicted about how, African Americans were like under the oppression of the white man in the US, but also like West Africa at that time was completely colonized by Europeans. And, there was no way for, African Americans to return to Africa if they were going to be going from one white man to another white man. I'm 27 years old, but this was my first time having a really deep dive into Pan-Africanism.
Mm,
And it was just really interesting to think about like the solidarity. So Martin Luther King Jr. talks a lot about the interconnectedness. So to think about slavery, civil rights, colonization, independence, World War II, and to think about Pan-Africanism, that was not something that I thought about. And just how all these different, fight for liberation, how they all like interconnected and affected each other. And so I think that was really eye-opening.
yeah, and I'm glad you said that, especially on Pan-Africanism, because as I recall, one of the things that interests me was trying to discover where's Pan-Africanism now. So like it seems like it's had like stages of development and might even say recession in the sense, um and so yeah, one of the things that that really behooved myself, and even I believe our tour guide who gave us a tour of the place was um was trying to figure out where is the state of Pan-Africanism both in the US and in Africa, or in Ghana more specifically. And it, at least at that, from what I got, it wasn't really that pretty of an answer, so to speak. um like I don't, from what I've seen, like it looks like the wave of Pan-Africanism has kind of decreased in this time. But and I know some would say that's uh because we need leaders at this time to rise up to extend past the even what the our past Pan-Africanist leaders have had.
Yes, I mean, you mentioned such a good point about sort of our guide at the W.E.B. Du Bois Center talking about like how important history is and how that sort of gives us a framework for understanding the current moment. And that if people don't remember their history, they cannot, it's like an umbilical cord. It's just very hard to progress if you don't remember your history. I feel like your questions about Pan-Africanism is just really important and kind of leads to like a good segue into talking about the Cape Coast Slave Castle, because, I think we had to learn that Pan-Africanism has not always been a thing, right? In terms of like in the past 200 years, or um, I think that was really an interesting and eye-opening perspective. So yeah, let's transition into, going to the Cape Coast Slave Castle. Yeah, the Cape Coast Slave Castle was like a 4-hour drive from across. So we got up, took a road trip. And the Cape Coast Slave Castle is like in Cape Coast, and it's the headquarters of, the in some ways the transatlantic slave trade. Over a million slaves, women and children, like went through Cape Coast. A fourth of them died like in the slave castle, and I feel like that's in some ways where this is where the brutality like was beginning. Obviously like it began with the capture, but there we were able to just learn about how, there were specific slave routes where they would just take the slaves through, and or the enslaved, and like it would be 2 to 3 men sort of chained together. There would be, very small windows, little ventilation. This castle was built by the English, but at that point, like the Portuguese, the Danes, several other groups of, Europeans had already sort of conquered that. But the part that we see today is like the what the English had built. And like, yeah, when someone died, they would just throw the bodies into the Atlantic Ocean. They were only fed enough food to survive, like what could fit in their hands. And then it'd be children as young as 6 years old. We learned that like they excavated the ground, and turns out the ground, even though it doesn't smell, like it's made pretty much of human feces. You think it's mud, but it's actually feces. And then just hearing about like if the enslaved like tried to rebel, they were put in a cell with like no ventilation, no light, and they were starved to death. And I think the part that stood out to me the most was that like there was, a church, right, an English church right above these slave dungeons. So while these slaves were facing like so much brutality, being in this like loading area for between 2 weeks to like, I mean, 3 weeks to like 2 months before they were shipped across the Atlantic, there was a church, like these Europeans praising the Lord right on top of it. Yeah. So yeah, Avery, I'm just curious, like what stood out to you about Cape Coast? Yeah. Anything that you would add?
And I think those same things that you said were basically right spot on to what I had experienced too at Cape Coast. Yeah, it was, man, I just can't even imagine, what they went through, there. I just remember just how dark it was in the castles where the
Mm,
slaves were stationed or
yeah,
were
and it
kept.
really makes you think about like, I remember just looking at my skin being like dang, like my ancestors like had to overcome this, like, and just thinking about what they overcame is just like, it just is really empowering. And like, it just really makes you think like, wow, like God is like amazing, and just like, really makes you kind of like, dang, I have this, like the same blood that like overcame this is like living in me, so but yeah, I think like Avery, at the Cape Coast Castle was where we really, I feel like, started to think about, um, I think, tribalism a little bit, because initially we learned that the Portuguese was sort of randomly kidnapping Africans, but then they realized that that was generating sort of too much conflict. And so it would be more strategic if the Europeans would just sort of exploit the intertribal wars. So in exchange for like guns and different things like that, the tribes like gave them slaves. And I think the big questions that we had like deep down inside was like, did the tribes like know, did they have a choice about sort of playing a role in the slave trade? And I think before going, we were like, no, they did not have a choice. But then what really stood out to us was seeing this plaque that they have where the tribes came together in 1992 for a ceremony, like different chiefs of tribes, and they apologized. It was an anonymity, but they apologized for their complicity um, in the slave trade. And I just thought that was like really eye opening. What was yeah, learning about that, like for you.
Yeah, and I guess it might be good to just to put out some definitions there too. So like I know, we were discussing earlier about Pan-Africanism, and even with contrasting that with tribalism, actually. So for Pan-Africanism, it's like this idea that basically, well, according to Britannica, that peoples of African descent have common interests and should be unified. And so basically that we should, people of African descent should stand in solidarity and be unified. So you think of, for example, like a unified um, Africa in addition to being unified with those of the African diaspora. Um, and so basically just kind of honing in on this common motherland, on this common bond that those of Africans have. It's that idea. And then, but tribalism would kind of be more towards this idea of, how would you describe tribalism? I guess I'll say one thing about it. So like, I think tribalism is more of this idea of being connected to one's like it's deeper than one's ethnic group. um it's like being of the same tribe is like being united by a common interest and almost and also by common ancestry. And
Yeah.
so it's like, for one's tribe, one inherits uh the ancestry of the tribe and also the common ideas that have been passed down in the tribe about other groups of people too. Would you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think you bring a really good point about like yeah, with the definitions. Tribes have a particular language, history, common ancestry, customs, dance, music, and all these different things, and like common sense of identity. And everyone like in West Africa, you would say is at least a part of one tribe. Um, and it to me, like, it's something that we started talking about a little bit was how at that time there was not this sort of idea of like this common, like we have common interests during the slave trade. Like, oh, these
Like we are
African.
Ghanaian or we are African.
Exactly. There wasn't this like, oh, like this Pan-Africanism that didn't really exist at that time. Like, these African tribes saw these other tribes as like not necessarily fellow brethren, as they would probably do now after sort of the slave trade, after colonization. They just saw the other group as this sort of enemy. And so they would capture these prisoners of wars and then um, sell them in exchange for guns. And I mean, we
And
did like,
other things too.
and other things, yeah, but we didn't really, I mean, at that point, we didn't really know, like, we don't think that they knew the brutality that the slaves would face because they had a different form of slavery. It wasn't the race-based chattel slavery. It was indentured servanthood, in Africa. So it's really interesting to think about how, one, they did not see the fellow Africans at that time as Africans, right? That's sort of a newer thing. And at the same time, like, just to think about how much, like, whether or not it was a necessary evil because the Europeans had the bigger guns, or whether or not these tribes actually benefited from, the slave trade. I think that, looking back, history is like showing us that like some of these like slaves were incredibly valuable. And some of these tribes made a lot of money from the slave trade. So it was also really interesting to understand these timelines of, how this it was a slave trade and then colonization. And the slave trade did not necessarily, it doesn't feel like that's when these sort of tribes like realized their common interest. It wasn't the slave trade, it was, I feel like it was colonization that sort of really brought these sort of tribes together. So I think that was also a really interesting observation. But I think another thing that was like that kind of we asked, Avery, I remember you asking like, how much are people in Ghana aware of this history of the slave of Cape Coast Castle?
Yeah. And at Cape Coast, the answer I got from our tour guide was not really. I even got the answer there. One of my tour guides is like, maybe even some in Cape Coast surprisingly may not know the full extent of the details of the transatlantic slave trade at Point Cape Coast. So that was pretty interesting, to know. But at Elmina Castle, actually, which was another slave castle, that tour guide was a lot more. Um, his perspective was that probably just more people are discovering it. That sometimes there are what do you call them when you go field trips? Field trips.
Oh
Some
yeah.
take
Yeah,
field
so
trips.
some
Yeah.
students are starting to go on field trips to learn about this history. But yeah, I think like you mentioned a really good point. Like, Cape Coast is one of the most popular tour sites for African Americans traveling to Ghana and or people of the African diaspora traveling to Ghana. And so to know that like this like how did the slave trade affect, this group of people on this side, right? Like it's really interesting. It's something to think about, but also like something that we had started to think about while we were at Cape Coast and Elmina was how our identities change, right? Like how um, either the people of the African diaspora, they lost their tribes, how their identities had changed, like their tribes were erased, but also to think about like how, you know, these tribes like came together to sort of fight off colonization as well. So um, another thing that came up, Avery, while we were there was um, like, or just something that started to like linger was, we were asked like, okay, we see the poverty, in Africa, I mean, or in like this particular region. We see the mosquitoes, the malaria, and like, you know, being like where we are as African Americans in our 20, having gone to Rice, having gone to Princeton, like, did we as African Americans benefit from being slaves? I know this is a heavy question, but this was something that like kind of came up that I think is, you know, I know it probably generates so many different thoughts, but I think it's important to like, this is a question that people like may ask, right? I mean, somebody asks us that, right? So, and I mean, I remember Avery, you saying like, Avery, you were really struck by this question. Honestly, you were like, what? I don't understand. Can you compare poverty? And I was like, but Avery, you have to understand, like, would you rather be like a slave where, the land is fruitful or a slave where the land is not fruitful? And I think we also started to really sort of think about like, Joseph in the Bible was sold into slavery. And because he was in slavery, like, you know, the Israelites like were able, not only Israelites, but other people were able to benefit, including Joseph's family. So yeah, just talk to me a little bit about like, the issues or the thoughts that you have when, someone may ask, like, did African Americans benefit from being slaves?
Sure. Yeah, so, my primary response has typically been that, you know, any benefit we have today uh in America, history shows that it really has been from, almost sadly from, from our own blood and that was shed in addition to our own, tears and sweat that was shed in working towards liberation. And I, whenever that question is asked, I just feel like that somehow that, to me, that elephant sized point is missed. That 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 African Americans have literally been in a fight, um and it is through that fight that we have, arrived here today. Now, for me, when I think about it, for African Americans born today, you know, we have, for example, like post civil rights movement, there are some rights that we have, even when it comes to voting rights, when it comes to entering to certain places, some things that we are able to access now, more freely, than we before we didn't have access to. But what I feel like is constantly overlooked is this aspect that nothing was just handed to us in that way. That, like, like I mentioned before, like it was literally, the blood and sweat of African Americans primarily, um,
Yeah.
that kind of, that really, in a sense of what I am being blessed from today.
Yeah, that's such a good point. Like we think about, you can't compare what happened to Joseph in the Bible to the plight of African Americans because it wasn't like Joseph's blood was shed. It was um for him to get those rights, for him to have that privilege. And so, yeah, I think like, it's really interesting that they brought up also, not only did they bring up sort of, African Americans being in America with so much infrastructure, opportunity, but also like thinking about like South Africa as well. Like, they have more infrastructure than probably other sort of West or South African countries. And um, but yeah, I mean, I guess for me, I was like, my response was like, white supremacy, like, will, capture you, separate you from your family, steal from you, you know, lynch your relatives, and then tell you, hey, you benefited. And so if anything, like, a lot, I mean, like everyone else has benefited from sort of like the plight of and just the suffering and the brutality and the subjugation that African Americans go
Mm.
through. So, but yeah, I think, okay, so just to transition, just to talk a little bit about sort of the fun things and how like, and just kind of getting into a little bit of the logistics, but the fun things like were very welcome because this was kind of a heavy trip and like being able to go and to Cocoon National Park and sort of climb like the tree um, like tops and like see the sort of the canopy. Like that was really fun. Yeah, Avery, what else was like a breath of fresh air while we were in Accra?
We did go to the beach, on like one of our first or second days, and that was pretty fun to go to. Um, uh, yeah, the things that I'm thinking of, yeah, definitely, Accra was fun, but I come from this, a city place, so, you know, um, we went to a national park, which was closer to Acapone, where so it was like a lot of like a forestry,
Oh yeah,
and that
the
was
Aburi.
very, yeah, Aburi Botanical Gardens.
Yes, we went there twice. Like, and that
That was
was
that
such a
good.
breath of fresh air. Like seeing the different nutmeg and like trees, the curry trees, and just like these beautiful trees, and just to be in touch with nature. Yeah.
Um, well, I mean, it was interesting going to the the supermarkets in Accra, you know. That
Yeah,
was
we
interesting. And I guess I would even say fun to see how we went to one of the largest supermarkets there. I believe that was in Accra, right? Or was that in Kumasi? That was in Kumasi, actually.
yeah, that was in
Yeah, yeah,
Kumasi.
yeah, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
and I mean, Kumasi was a whole experience as well, like being able to go to the capital of the Ashanti Kingdom. And that really helped us learn a little bit more about like different tribes and like to see that like even to this day, like they actually have a king, who is like has this power and like it's really respected and revered. Um and yeah, it's just so interesting to see like how in like West Africa, like they or in Ghana, like they really take the king very seriously. It's just a lot different from in the US. Yeah. We also like got to learn about like bead making and kente cloth um and then also it was really interesting to like experience the food. Yeah, Avery, what was that experience like for you?
Yeah. So I had some exposure to West African foods via the Rice African Student Association at Rice. So there I was mostly familiar with jollof rice, plantains, um, and various types of chicken. And I feel that I stuck to that diet in Ghana. And so I didn't really get into the fufu, so to speak, at least on this time, maybe in my next trips. But so that was basically my experience with the food. I was able to find something I could eat at basically every restaurant that we went, or something that I wanted to eat at every restaurant that I went.
Yeah, Avery, you mentioned a really good point about like how you tried to stick to your sort of jollof rice, chicken, and plantain diet. I would say that like, this is sort of where, white supremacy comes in again. It's like nothing made me feel more westernized than the food. I think that, it's a shame that like in some ways, like we even asked our tour guide, like many African Americans like that he take on tour, they tend to be the most picky eaters. And it's like just to know how we've become even sort of estranged from our food. Like, and I was a little bit more adventurous than you, Avery. I tried one of the signature dishes, the Ghanaian dishes, the banku and tilapia. And also, but I had to tell my tour guide to like leave the table as I sort of take that in. And it was it's just I actually have the banku with the okra soup, and it's just like a completely different texture. It was good. It was just like I wasn't used to sort of the sour fermented flavors. But yeah, I think it's definitely an acquired taste. But yeah, Avery, the beau frat was good that we had, which was those fried like dough balls, which I think is similar to sort of Nigerian puff puff. But oh yeah, Avery, on our last one of our last Ghanaian meals, like um we had what did we eat? Avery, red. And that ended up being our favorite meal.
Well,
Yeah.
I said that was my favorite. I know that was your favorite meal too.
Yeah, it was both our favorite meals. So red
Okay.
is like
Yeah,
this
yeah,
like
yeah.
palm with black eyed peas and like a lot of like onions and peppers, I think. And then it also is on top of like some flat fried ripe plantains. Yeah. So red was our favorite.
Yeah.
But another thing is like, yeah, and then something that our family really wants to know about was like clothing and shopping. Like, that was really a cool experience to see. Like, we really had to sort of haggle like when you're shopping and but also to see like at the supermarkets like just how many seamstresses there are, like you get your clothes custom made. That's something that we're not really familiar with here, but it's really cool, just seeing the bright colors. And I don't know, it's just there's nothing like putting on like attire of your like own sort of like ancestral, like this is what they sort of wore. So and just to see that tradition continuing. So Avery, I wanted to ask you to speak a little bit about um kind of like the African traditional religion, the oral history, and also the Bible. I know you've taken theology classes there, and so yeah, just being able to sort of, take classes there, but also immerse yourself in that society. I just want to know, like, if you could just speak to your experience and what that was like.
Mm, yeah. So African traditional religion is basically this phrase that I guess in academic settings is used to refer to traditional religions in Africa. that typically, have primal elements in them. So basically, when I say primal elements, elements of primality, so to speak, or primal spirituality, typically includes seeing the world as in which this, like, the spiritual side of the world is very much connected to the physical side of the world too. So like seeing, engaging in a universe that in which physical circumstances are rooted in spiritual causes. So like, hey, why is there, so much rain, on, in this season? Well, maybe God or the gods are very satisfied with us, or in vice versa, or in another way, why is there a famine, for example? Well, maybe there's, maybe there's an issue in the spiritual realm that we need to address. um so learning about, so basically, like, African traditional religion, especially in West Africa, was or was, it was and is, widely practiced. And in Ghana specifically, so Ghana is primarily a Christian country. So there's, in the three top religions are Christianity, Islam, and what we term African traditional religion. And what's interesting though too is that different elements between those religions can transition between those religions. So, for example, in African traditional religion, there is a supreme being. So there's a God above all other gods, so to speak. And kind of similarly in Christianity, there is what Christianity would call, the one true God, who's a creator God, so to speak. And so seeing how there's even some commonalities between these different forms of religions was very interesting, but also to, in Ghana, visit some shrines, for some African traditional religious shrines in Ashanti land. I believe was the only one we went to, but it was very interesting to see, like, the ways in which African traditional religion is alive today, but also many or some people there, some religious people practice African traditional religion and Christianity, for example, and it may even be the same, with Islam and African traditional religion. So, for example, one example is, at least there in some of the masses, the view of African traditional religion in terms of how it addresses problems is that the problems it addresses are more imminent problems. So like, our problems that are more, you know, on the day to day. So like I said, like, man, what if there's somebody stole something from me, I want it back, or whatnot. How can I address? How is this a spiritual issue that I can address? So that's one thing, maybe, that someone could go up to um, to a to consult about in ATR, while that same person also may, also believe Jesus is God, and that Jesus is Lord of all. In that person's complex, the Christianity that person has, the purpose it serves more of man, I want to go to heaven, and so, Jesus is, I have Jesus in my heart to go to heaven. So it's very interesting to see how, with some, those are combined. With others, there isn't a compatibility, like that, and so it's very pluralistic, or is very, yeah, pluralistic in a real religious sense in that way, or pragmatic in a religious sense in that way, so to speak. So
Yeah, I think you mentioned a really good point about how African traditional religion, and also like using it as a lens for understanding, for reading the Bible, and just sort of this sense of like just how like I don't want to use the word primitive, but like how primitive like the Bible can be or like or is, right? Like and sort of it's just I don't know, it just really helps you see the Bible in a completely different lens. But and it's just a lot different from sort of this modern sort of Western sort of enlightened perspective. And I just think it was really cool to sort of understand sort of the more traditional elements of the Bible.
Oh
And
yeah. No, yeah. I mean, definitely. And I just want to add, yeah, like the worldview of African traditional religion is definitely closer to the worldview of this. Like there are many affinities between them. Might even say more affinities between African traditional religious worldview or that primal worldview in in our Western quote unquote enlightened worldview. Like you mentioned, there's much similar affinities between the ATR um, and, for example, ancient Israelite religion.
yeah, so it's really cool to be able to like, you have experience like learning about African traditional religion and just how that's sort of giving you such an insight into your own faith as a Christian. And then another thing is that I was thinking about that I mean, we could do another video on this, but like how, West Africa is in that process of decolonizing their Christianity, decolonizing their education, and just how much, colonization has affected sort of their education and their theology and how they, um, yeah, experience God and sort of the world. So because like I think the statistics will say that Ghana is 70% Christian. So it's really interesting to think about how that theology affects their sort of day-to-day life, which we could talk more about that later. And then another thing is like, Avery, you've kind of did some work on this, sort of the difference between sort of Western African theology and also sort of, theology of like African Americans or Black theology. And so that conversation is also really interesting because, you know, one group of people were colonized, another group of people faced slavery. And so it's just some different sort of theological interpretations. Okay, so just to wrap things up, I wanted to provide space, Avery, for your closing thoughts and takeaways. I know I have a few, but yeah, what are some of your closing thoughts?
Well, I'm thankful to God for allowing me to graduate from my program in Ghana. Even during a pandemic, being able to come back safely without COVID-19, for example. And I'm thankful, yeah, that even that you came on this trip with me and that you've been on the journey too, Brooke. And so, yeah, I'm very grateful for those experiences.
What are some of the things that you're taking away from this trip?
Um, well, that one that I really would want to go back uh on the trip to see in ways which I can, um like I mentioned earlier, have an impact there, and ways in which I can be more of a pan Africanist, and what that means for me is what I'm taking away from it. And I really, it even more convinces me that that leaders are needed, to really step up and to desire, change for a community where, both here in America and also, for example, in Ghana too. Um, and so it makes, I'm taking away, what does it look like to be a part of that community, even initiate it if I, don't see it, yet. As I mentioned before, I know Pan-Africanism today, um, it doesn't appear to be just as strong as it was in that way with, for example, W.E.B. Du Bois and President Kwame Nkrumah, for example. And so it's like, what things need to be revived, uh,
Yeah.
and how can our current accessibilities or even with technology and stuff make things better, than what they were before.
Yeah, I would say overall, like kind of like you, it made me a bit more practical about how can I, help marginalized communities and play a role. um, and helping with infrastructure, like using my STEM degree. And then another thing is like thinking about how much our identities change. It's not really something that I have thought much about until I was in Ghana, and you just learn like, in 1957, before 1957, this really was like this region was not necessarily a country. Like it became like they gained independence in 1957, and that's in our grandparents' lifetime. So it's like how, um, yeah, it's just really interesting to think about how our identities evolve, and just like the only reason why like Ghana, like it sometimes like countries seem so arbitrary because like Europeans just say, oh, this region is going to be this particular country. And it's like, but what about those people who had an identity before a European said, hey, you're part of this country, or y'all are going to be together, or we colonized, this is a territory, So it's like, it's just, to me, it just reminded me like that it's really important to remember your identity before it was sort of erased, or before someone else sort of kind of like made another identity. And I really think it could just help Americans understand their identity better. And then another thing that I'm taking away with is like just honoring the stories of my own ancestors, like, and how in some ways they may have experienced betrayal on both sides of the Atlantic. And, but at the same time, like, as Martin Luther King Jr. said so often and so eloquently, that justice is so interconnected. Um, and so how like the liberation in the US affects the liberation in Africa, and like, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So, and then Avery, I remember like you also, while we were on the trip, kind of talked a little bit about how important the role Africa, like how important the role of Africa is for the advancement of the world. And so I really feel like Africa like has so much room to show us like a new model, when it comes to advancing to a just society. Yeah, thank you so much, Avery. And thank you all for listening. If you've listened thus far, and we hope that you were able to take something away. And please give us your feedback. Please like let us know if you have any questions, or maybe we could even do a follow-up video. Thank you so much. Goodbye.